Hi, John Browning. I've got a question for you here in a second, but how are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic. How about you?
Good. I'm doing great. I'm thinking risky today. I was thinking one of the riskiest things I've ever done was jump out of an airplane. And I've done that twice now I had a parachute, but it was really cool, but it was risky. You tell people you've done that and they're like, what? Do you have a risky thing that you've ever done?
Oh my goodness. Well, almost every chance I get, not quite every day, but every chance I get on a motorcycle. I get on my
That's,
Harley and ride it. A lot of people would say that's a risky thing,
that
and
is a
it is.
risky
'Cause
thing.
I have taken a spill on that, and essentially crushed my left leg. So it is risky, and but that's probably the most risky thing that I do.
Okay, that'll work. Well, the other thing we want to talk about, I want to talk about investment type risks around investment today. That's the topic that I want to throw your way. What can you tell me about types of risks in investments?
Well, first risk is that people listening to this podcast might think that this is specific investment advice, and it is not.
Mm-hmm.
I cannot give you individual investment advice on this podcast because I don't know who you are, but I would love to have you give me a call or reach out to me on guardianrockwealth.com and sign up for a free consultation. I'm not going to sell you anything. Would love just to add some value and some help. Then I can give you potentially some individual investment advice, but this is not about that. This is just explaining some of the different types of risk that we see and maybe some misconceptions that are out there about risk.
Awesome. That's great. Well, let's have a casual conversation about from a guy who doesn't know. Talk to me about a couple of the big types of risks that are out there that I need to be aware of.
Well, risk is one of my, actually, it's not for a lot of people, it's one of my favorite subjects because for several years, when I worked on Wall Street, I was in charge specifically of the risk position at the firm. And I'll never forget the one day we were doing our trading. The trading desk was crazy as always, lots of phones going off and everything else. And I took a phone call and he said, on the other end, I hear this is so and so, and it was the name of the person who owned the company. And of course, on a trading desk, we're always joking around with each other and playing practical jokes. It's just sort of the way things go. And I was like, oh, yeah, right, sure. And I hung up the phone. So, turns out that wasn't a great move on my part. It was the owner of the company, and he had a
Wow.
question about our risk position from the previous night. And he called back, and luckily, I recognized that this was actually there's one type of risk is recognizing the owner of your company is really calling you.
Classic.
But it did, those times on Wall Street, managing that risk made risk one of my favorite subjects. And I find that there's just so many people that misunderstand what risk is. And with most financial advisors, they will, and firms, they'll give you a very long, kind of boring list of questions that are generic and
Yeah.
do you like pepperoni on your pizza or not? And then they determine based on the answers to those questions what
Yeah.
your risk number is. We never put a number on anyone at Guardian Rock. We'll use some of those questions as well, but rather than that, it's not just about what the answer to those questions are, but it's more about there's really one or two questions that we ask that we're not just listening to the actual response, we're listening to how the person says that response
Mm-hmm.
and not just what they say, but the tone of voice that they use when they say it. And we challenge some of their assumptions. And it's really how a person feels about risk, frankly, and we try and sometimes actually adjust their thinking about what risk is as well. And we give them some real life examples and see what their real time reaction to those real life situations that we've experienced in our time on Wall Street and elsewhere that actually happen in the market, and how would they feel if that particular thing happened, to kind of maybe adjust their understanding of risk first. Because there's really two major types of risk, and that's the risk of being too aggressive and experiencing sleepless nights and maybe experience a surprise that you didn't understand what that downside risk means, because nobody cares about the upside risk,
Yeah,
but
that's
that's
true.
actually risk too. And when you see a security or a portfolio that jumps way up in value, you need to understand that typically speaking, historically speaking, something that goes up really high very quickly can actually and often does fall even quicker.
Hmm.
So the market tends, and we saw this in March of 2020, where the market dropped 30% very, very quickly. Now, it didn't come up 30% that quickly. It
Mm-hmm.
took the rest of the year, and thankfully it did recover, and even more so throughout, but that took the entire year. So understanding that that's kind of the way things work and adjusting for what your feelings about risk are. And also, this is a very common one, is that risk of not taking enough risk and not
Oh.
being aggressive enough to accomplish your goals with the resources you have. And most people don't talk about that, but it's a very real risk. And either they brush over that, or they try and make some assumptions that should sort of make things work and make it shove it in there. And it really doesn't. It should not be brushed over. And maybe they come up with an unrealistic expectation, or try and, well, I'll just dump more money in, when dumping more money in might not be a realistic uh, option for the individual. So that's a very real
Hmm.
risk as well. And the third one that I just have to throw in there, because so many people do it, is market timing.
Oh,
Market
yes.
timing is always, and I very rarely use that word, it's always a bad idea.
Mm-hmm.
There is no human being, sorry about the alarm there,
It's all right.
no human being that can accurately, consistently time the market, no matter what they say.
Right.
So just don't do it. But adjust your portfolio so that you don't have to.
Right.
That's the key thing, right?
That is the key thing. And it's funny because market timing, not always, I'm sure, and I'm not dug into it, but we talked an episode ago or two about greed and all of that a little bit. And sometimes that's what always sounds to me is market timing is like, we're going to get this one, get all the gains, we're going to get out. And it feels like greed versus what your strategy is to build a portfolio, adjust it over time, and take advantage when you can, but don't put yourself at too much risk, because when you're at too much risk, then things internally, my emotions go wacky, right? But that's why you have to have those conversations with John and his team, because I know my wife and I, we tend to be very conservative. We don't like a lot of risk. But I've got a dear friend who's just like, throw it all on the wall and see what sticks. Let's just throw it out there. We'll make some more. He's totally not risk adverse at all. Glad I'm not married to him, right? So it's everybody's different, but you don't know that until you find this third party person like John Browning to talk to understand your values and ask some of those questions, because I mean, investing is an emotional thing for most people.
Yep.
And so that's we have to understand just different types of risk, right?
Right.
And
Right.
having you there as
A
a
lot of studies have been done, from a psychological perspective, and the pain of loss is much exponentially more painful than the pleasure that you get from the gains that you see.
that's right.
And that's something to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is that, and a lot of people just don't quite wrap their heads around this, is that if a particular security or portfolio goes down by, say, 10%, just to get back to even, it's a little bit over 11% gain that you need to recover from that.
Mm-hmm.
So understanding that is important as well.
Yeah. Well, and one of the other risks, and you may have mentioned it, but you weren't as blatant as I'm going to be, is I'm going to call it the risk of being unbalanced. And that would be if you have a portfolio, but you aren't rebalancing it regularly, you're really putting yourself at risk, because as your portfolio grows, it's going to become too heavy, let's say, on one segment or something. And that's what you help your clients do, is make sure that if something's growing, great, but we're going to as I say, take some money off the table. We're going to rebalance that and make sure you're in a safe position. Am I saying that right?
You're saying it exactly right. I'm glad you brought it up because we see that all the time. And there's two things that happen is the individual says, well, I don't want to take a taxable gain. I'd have to pay taxes on that. I keep saying taxes is a thing. It's not the only thing.
Right.
And we had a client that they were in a particular stock. I'm sure if I said what it was, but I won't for compliance reasons. Out in California, maybe it was a utility stock that had really appreciated. And they said, I don't want to take the taxable gain. I don't want to pay taxes. And we tried to convince them, hey, we see some real issues with this particular security. We think it could potentially decline in value, and it's a very large portion of your portfolio. They just wouldn't do it. And sure enough, that particular business experienced a very difficult time, and they lost way more than they would have had they sold it and paid the taxes.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to me how difficult it is in general, for people to take gains.
Yeah.
They just think it's going to, that's obviously just going to keep going up forever. And the fact is that it generally doesn't go up forever.
Right.
Nothing grows to the moon, so to speak.
That's right.
And nobody ever went broke taking a gain.
That's right. Well, unfortunately, your client did not pay capital gains just like they wanted to. So be careful what you ask for.
That's right. They did not. Yes.
Take the advice of John Browning, and that's why he's there. I mean, that's, as I say, John, that's why you make the big bucks, to help me make those decisions, right? Use your guy and follow their advice, because the cool thing about you, John, not only are you brilliant when it comes to all of this, but you're, and I'll say this nice, you're disengaged emotionally from your client's money. They're in it. It's their money. They've got emotions tied to it. You can see things from an unbiased perspective much more easily than they can. And that's the value that you bring to the table. I mean, just one of the values, but you can see things that they can't, and you can navigate them through the storms of life, because you're not so emotionally charged with paying taxes. Like, well, it's okay, but we've got some strategies here that might help, right?
Yep, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's this has been a pretty risky conversation, so I want to tie this up. And again, this is not investment advice. This is a conversation. If you want investment advice, reach out to John Browning and have a conversation with him. Let him help you navigate really life, because I was going to say finances, but John, what you do is it's finances, but it's much broader, because you really want people to build a life, not just a portfolio. The portfolio, the money, the assets, that all is to serve us in living a life and building the life that we really, really want once we understand our values. And so reach out to John Browning, guardianrockwealth.com. And while you're there, request a copy of his book, set up a Zoom call with John or a phone call, and have a great conversation with John Browning. John, thank you so much for a great conversation around risk. Appreciate that.
All right. Thank you. And we'll see you next week.